Welcome to Senses, Fort Point Theater Channel's very informal, very eclectic series of short performance events. I'm Mark Miller, one of Fort Point Theater Channel's 20 co-artistic directors. Over the years, Senses presented several book events, as well as poetry, plays, music, vocal jazz, videos, animation, and various blends of all these. Senses is always free, although, of course, we always accept donations to help us pay all the performers who appear with Senses. For this, our 36th Senses and the first virtual one we present, straight from Brooklyn, Boston-born Cyrus McQueen. He'll be reading from his new book, Tweeting Truth to Power, chronicling our caustic politics, crazed times, and the great black and white divide. Cyrus is a comedian, cultural critic, and writer, and his mirthful and insightful analyses on race and politics have resonated throughout Twitter. In Tweeting Truth to Power, Cyrus shares the personal and political journey he began in 2016, when he put aside the microphone to get serious about inequality, exploring his own painful story alongside the nation's past and present. Tweeting Truth to Power offers us Cyrus's rich, nuanced look into America's racial legacy. It was my privilege to read a draft excerpt from Tweeting Truth to Power this summer. It immediately brought to mind writers like James Baldwin, Richard Wright, and Frederick Douglass, people whose angry, wide-ranging prose borders on poetry. I was hooked on the rhythmic beauty and powerful content in Cyrus's words. Tonight, Cyrus will read first, and then FBTC co-artistic director Danny Gessner will moderate a question and answer period. You can submit questions through YouTube's chat feature. And in case you're wondering, you can pre-order Tweeting Truth to Power through his website, cyrusmcqueen.com, and it'll be available on Amazon soon. Or you can donate $50 or more to Fort Point Theater Channel by tomorrow night, and you'll get a free copy as soon as they are available. Now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Cyrus McQueen to our virtual stage.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to the 4 Point Theater Channel. Thank you, Mark. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you guys so much. Now, Tweeting Truth to Power is a book that developed somewhat inauspiciously. Everybody has been, white knuckling through the last 4 years. And so as we've embarked on a very, very tenuous and caustic period in American life, I, as a comedian and as a writer and as a humorist, was first trying to combat what was occurring through Twitter. Being that the president and so many political entities were using the platform to sow hate and discord, I seized on the platform to try to, make sense of it all. Through that process, I ended up creating enough fodder, I felt, for a book that went a little bit farther, a little bit deeper, that provided the accurate context for this American moment and the unhealthy things that were occurring on a daily basis. So the first excerpt that I want to read is from the chapter called Turning Back the Clock. And this is my initial thoughts upon Trump seizing the executive branch of the government. Donald Trump is a racist. There is no reason to ponder the probability of that which has been proven over time to be a patent, immutable truth. Though the media has been infatuated with posing this question rather redundantly ever since he first voiced racist sentiments, I reckon it as a sort of rhetorical device, an empty query compelled by those seeking soundbites who themselves are clearly aware of his malice. At least that's what I would like to tell myself. However, the pithy, pitiable snippets that have worked their way into those chyrons in the lower inches of the television screen evince a failure by the talking heads, epitomizing society's even greater failure, as they merely project and thus reflect our country's utter lack of commitment with regard to this outstanding issue. Race is just another aspect of the media's mindless routine, relegated to background noise, buried somewhere between sports and weather, unequivocally reduced to just another thing. Whenever outlets do devote a few measly minutes to this all-encompassing issue, the existential implications evaporate almost as quickly as the text on the screen. In these moments, such empty wording lands with a deafening thud, it ceasing to be inquiry and transforming into more of a declaration. It is not a matter of whether or not racism is a factor with Donald Trump, or in our greater society. For those white journalists now juxtaposed with the reality of this charged era and what is of grave consequence for those like myself, this sort of feigned sincerity tends to infuriate, their obtuseness far more evocative. Given what they now so cavalierly report, it's clear that racism has never been a factor for them. The fact remains that our press, along with the greater public, knows the apparent and unfortunate answer to the question they so casually posit, even if this disingenuousness seems to work its way into the news cycle with such great frequency. Racism, to put it plainly, is as crucial a component of Donald Trump as his blood type. It is the oxygen he breathes, it fuels and defines him, and it distinguishes him from his distinguished predecessor and the millions of Americans who sought to overcome the societal scourge when they cast ballots for Barack Obama and the change that he proffered. The insidious, brutal implication of Donald Trump's election is that a wounded criminal cadre of Americans brazenly cast ballots for him specifically because his candidacy represented another form of change. Unfortunately, the change in this instance was less in the traditional sense of the word and more of a restitution, a return to a dynamic that had fueled the American power structure prior to 2009. Donald Trump did not campaign to make America anew, but to reestablish a prior status quo. His election would therefore be revanchist, white America's form of reparations, an endeavor to make America great again based on the flawed premise that Caucasian control is what makes America great. This was the underlying theme to a presidential run that came roaring out of the gates to ghastly generalizations of Mexicans and minorities and established that this would be indeed a campaign unlike any we had ever grown accustomed to. Whether we accepted it or not, this was going to be a presidential race about race. This would be a referendum on the previous 8 years and the unmistakable metamorphosis America underwent. Donald Trump was going to make this so with every flagrant and furtive move, his descent on that Trump Tower escalator, sending the country on a descent into madness. Far too many Americans have sadly fallen sway to the spell, the hypnotic, transfixing flame, the only source of heat they feel they might ever experience, luring them closer and closer with promises of progress, even redemption, until it is ultimately too late and that fire unleashed reveals its true intention, not to warm, but to burn, using them to feed its own insatiable desire to grow bigger and bigger. These unfortunate men and women throughout Middle America will ultimately come to realize this too late, if they even realize it at all. Their scorched and singed wings destroyed by a blaze they helped create and whose capacity for destruction they sadly underestimated. In Donald Trump's fire, they see their reflection. But though they may bond through bigotry, they fail to grasp that they possess neither the capital nor the capriciousness that his affluence provides him, the carte blanche that supplied the accelerant to his inferno in the first place. This is the very class dispensation that contributes to the interminable path of destruction he leaves in his wake. Having lived a life of unaccountability, Trump's tempestuousness could lead him into fruitless battles against threats both perceived and actual, his indemnity always absorbing the inevitable fallout. These malleable minds have no way of knowing that his enemies are not their enemies, or that he has no real enemies except those he outright earns through his own villainy. Trump manipulates moths into believing they are everything they are not, and though they lack his economic power, with their intentions spelled out for them and a renewed sense of purpose, he persuades these revitalized pests to swarm and attack Black and brown people, to eat away at the very fabric of our country, all while losing sight of the raging fire that is engulfing us all. The next excerpt that I would like to read it deserves a little bit of context. See, in writing this book, I was looking at the last 4 years of American life, but in doing so, it kind of forced me to look back at the last 40 years of my life, and coincidentally to also then go farther back and look at the last 400 years of Black life in this country or on this continent. So the last 4 years bred the last 40 years, bred the last 400 years. And so I wanted to provide a sort of greater context for everything that was going on. This, of course, forced me to then look back at my own upbringing, growing up in the city of Boston, in Roxbury, in the inner city, and sort of my earliest understanding of race and when these conflicts and contradictions sort of became apparent to me. So the next excerpt that I would like to read is from the chapter titled Brother from Another Planet. I pick up where I had just enrolled in the METCO program. Those in Massachusetts know the METCO program is responsible for busing bright young inner city children to the Boston suburbs to attend schools. So this is from the brother from another planet. The excesses of white wealth in the 1980s were on full display here. The conspicuous consumption of trickle-down economics creating a dazzling, dizzying picture that contrasted distinctly with the one I had come to know as normal. Here were homes with swimming pools, tennis courts, and even superfluous supplements such as gift wrapping rooms, reflecting the largesse of unregulated capitalism. The luxury vehicles parked beside them were the same vessels that often shuttled my classmates to and from school, the same exact ones I would often sneak a quick, covetous glimpse of when I embarked and disembarked my rusted bus. By day, I touched down on a planet where the flush side of Reaganomics reached the intended beneficiaries of his tax cuts on income and capital gains, while back home, come evening, I witnessed the negative effects of that very same voodoo and the spell that this cast over Black and Brown America. As Reagan proceeded to pulverize unions and shutter mental institutions, ramping up the morbid, moribund war on drugs, as the influx of crack cocaine and its corresponding prison sentences compounded matters, creating a rich tapestry of tragedy in Roxbury, I watched with alarm as the lifeless men and women of color delivered by these lecherous decisions, those who had been discarded, deemed American flotsam, wandered about this dystopian backdrop muttering to themselves. As crumbling infrastructure embellished this hellish picture, shuttered businesses replaced once teeming buildings, their hollow shells mirroring the void within the men and women who now claim them for shelter and shooting up. This gallery of ghouls searching for life or any facsimile of it and periodically putting themselves on display for change, for any compensation, just in order to continue this living exhibition. As a 6- and 7-year-old standing beneath the Orange Line's newly defunct L train, holding the hand of a mother who quickly shuttled me beyond the discernible blight, I watched men who were cloaked in its darkness eventually emerge from the shadows to plead their cases. Upon receiving their settlements, they had immediately transferred these greenbacks into the waiting hands of hustlers, their solvency slipping right away in this secret and ritualistic shake. This was a time of simplistic, dismissive slogans, when addiction was blithely addressed through admonishment, when those who'd succumb to the needle long before it would poke middle America and be deemed a public health crisis were the true forgotten ones. Their pain palpable yet unregistered, noticeable yet null. It was a time when men would shout 4-letter words at passersby, their sunken cheeks signaling an unforeseen consequence, this erosion telegraphing a growing 4-letter monster exacerbated by a president's indifference was fast approaching to level this area for good and wipe them from the face of the earth. I vividly recall seeing my cousin Butch shortly before the storm would claim him, when he was bowed and barely keeping afloat. It was a beautiful summer day, but upon realizing that the gaunt man emerging from a similarly gaunt and indistinct hovel on Northampton Street and was waiting ahead of me was my once mighty cousin, it created a cloud blocking out any radiance emanating from the August sun. This pall engulfed us both on this late summer afternoon in the South End as, mesmerized, I began following him for no discernible reason. I trailed him fearfully at first, scared that he would see me, but more terrified that he would notice that I had seen him. A mere reflection of the man who could once claim to have muscles the size of bowling balls, something we younger cousins used to exclaim gleefully as we gripped his bulging biceps, jumping on his solid frame as if he was a human jungle gym. I watched now as, rudderless and reduced to a hull, he bobbed along the sidewalk. The Charles River appeared to have moved inland as the massive I observed transformed into a busy waterway almost instantly, its current appearing to carry him, at times threatening to capsize what was left of him. He almost resembled a pirate flag now. Every block or so you could tell that another wave had crashed into him, his black skull and bones thoroughly baked by exposure, absorbing the impact as he curved forward, briefly overcome. He'd slowly stoop over for what seemed like an eternity. Watching rapidly perched on the steps of any number of stoops along the way, I waited patiently for each particular ebb to tide to ebb before he finally fitfully resumed his wayward passage. I continued following him, appalled yet transfixed, the excitement I felt that of a child sneakily watching a forbidden horror movie. I was spooked yet exhilarated, disturbed yet determined to finish what I'd started. And the long and short of it is, I simply could not turn away. But though I fancied myself some sort of storm chaser, I was way too young, my vision, my conscience too unformed, too unschooled to understand what I was seeing. I was neither capable of grasping this grotesqueness nor able to process the sheer magnitude of his impending destruction. But mostly, I was simply too naive to fathom either the virulence of these uncharted waters or the depths of my cousin's abyss. It would take several more blocks before I realized Butch was heading nowhere. I do not recall quite when I decided to call off my maritime pursuit, but I eventually did somewhere around Columbus Avenue. That's where he turned right and, dodging several cars, disappeared on the other side of the intersection into the vortex of Back Bay. I'll never forget floating after my cousin that summer afternoon, or the denouement to this American horror story when, shortly thereafter, I found myself staring down at him. His heavy lids from that afternoon now closed completely, permanently. His near skeletal remains in the cheap suit blanketing him a reflection of what had become a global pandemic. God damn it! I recall my father exclaiming, his anger gathering momentum as it ramped up to a host of colorful words. He had to follow in your fucking uncle's footsteps. My father loudly upbraided, unbothered by the bowed heads that popped up inside the funeral home upon his rendered verdict. Later, I learned that my father, like his brother and his first cousin who now lay before us in permanent repose, had all battled this squall. Yet he had been the only one to emerge victorious, the only one to lock himself below deck in a basement apartment for days and days before finally, fatefully, steering out of it. His audible frustration was an odd puzzle piece that I held onto for years, until much later, when it helped me fill in a picture of my father and of a family that reflected the great promise and eventually the greater pain that awaited so many Black Americans upon migrating north in the early 20th century. Fortunately for my father and for the life that he would go on to create, he escaped it all well before addiction and disease would conspire to create the perfect storm in the inner city. His palpable anger that day was perhaps a sign of survivor's remorse, yet also undeniably a blistering, visceral lesson to the young son standing beside him not to follow this same frightful course. The next excerpt, I'm going to read is a book called Funny Business. And one thing that I had to constantly remind myself in the last 4 years, I first began tweeting humorous asides and jokes and, little jocular retorts to everything that was happening on Trump's Twitter handle, what was happening in conservative media. But at some point, I got too serious because the Times dictated that I needed to take a more serious tone, which is what inspired me to, of course, write the book. But every now and again, I will remind myself that I am a comedian, that I like to make fun, and that, I do provide a service and people need to laugh right now. Well, the next excerpt I'm going to read is from a chapter in the book titled Funny Business. And it is actually a return to something that I speak about earlier, very early in the book, about when I performed for a mostly older, white, conservative audience in New Jersey. And what the show's producer basically warned me was going to be Trump country, because they had an incident a couple of weeks before with supporters causing a ruckus. So this was me, after having a triumphant show there, returning to the scene of the crime, as I call it, and me returning to that show and that audience. I furtively retraced my steps, arriving to another sold-out house, retirees sipping rosé, the men clad in a rich palette of turquoise and peach button-downs. As I paced the hallway behind the back tables, sensations from the year before returned to me. The audience began emanating approval to the MC in the form of raucous cheering and whistles. As he laid groundwork, I recalibrated and shifted things around. The feature act went on, presenting gems not too dissimilar to the ones embedded in my leather-bound notebook. I held mine up to his in the moment, comparing and contrasting before determining that my precious stones bore enough of a resemblance to theirs that the patrons would likely buy mine too. That would be my way in now. General jokes about the weather, not unlike those about sports, would, I hoped, provide me a perfect springboard into another warm reception. The knot in my throat threatened to constrict my breathing as the host announced me, but the muscle memory of vaulting on stage soon took over. My body began moving without my consent. The previous comic, having addressed the inclement weather, gave me an anchor for my opening joke, a yarn about white weathermen vilifying black ice while never mentioning the destruction caused by regular ice. Almost immediately, I heard the boom. That all too familiar, oh so welcome sound after your words detonate an explosion of rolling laughter. I was back. Opening on race with my comedic examination of societal contradictions eliciting that big of a reaction, it reduced any lingering fear that was keeping me from fully being present. I proceeded with the pyrotechnics, transitioning seamlessly into growing up Black, being Black in an interracial marriage, even the silly way that racism propagates through such technological advancements as autocorrect. Every punchline popped. The clapping hands convinced me that not only did my truth go off, but that it was landing. The distant rumble reflecting the slight delay as my gospel rippled throughout the venue. The sweat began to trickle down my forehead, a drop landing on the screen of my phone when I checked to see how far I had ventured into my set. Already at the 42-minute mark, and despite the discharge, I had yet to launch into any of my Trump material. With less than 20 minutes to bring this flight in for a landing, I addressed the orange elephant in the room. So, I gotta ask, how do we feel about Trump? The response was nearly unanimous. Boos began to emanate from the bombed out crowd, the corroboration all I needed to begin lighting the fuse for the finale. Can you believe Trump says he isn't racist? Says he's the least racist person you'll ever meet? No. If it looks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it's named Donald, boom, the cracking of thunder reverberated throughout the cloud of fresh faces. I remember the heads of those around the stage darting from side to side as each person found comfort and confirmation in the laughter of the person beside them. This stunning visual adding a compelling layer, rolling laughter from the crowd leading to this rewarding display, the sea of happy faces resembling rollicking waves. I did not hear the different kind of boos first. No, the ones that all comedians dread. You would have been hard-pressed to hear any signs of disapproval in that extravaganza, but perhaps my inner ear was attuned to or even anticipating such a response. That all too real possibility that had preceded my journey and lingered just over my shoulder the entire evening was indeed transpiring. My fears would be confirmed when the applause died down just enough for me to make out a faint "fuck you" from the back of the audience. Almost immediately, the sea parted and I could make out shadows of figures rising, sounds of commotion supplanting the more favorable noises that had been drowning it out. I observed those looks of satisfaction suddenly morph into looks of concern as every head was soon rubbernecking towards the back of the room. I had already begun my next joke, and so as not to telegraph my own disconcertment, I pushed on through. To my consternation, the joke failed to land. My mind immediately began racing as I feverishly sought a way out of this turbulence. I started to think of retorts. I started loading the chamber with a few deadly comebacks just in case I had to start firing back. But alas, no one was paying attention to me as all eyes were now trained on this table of 6 disgruntled Trump supporters from Cape May. As they continued their hijack, I can now definitively make out the "fuck yous." The manager began to quickly hustle them from the venue, but under the burning stage lights, what was likely a matter of seconds felt like an eternity. But before I could even recover, let alone retaliate, magic occurred. The audience, my charges, they soon stood up to protect me. They began heckling my hecklers. Steadily at first, then in a precipitous downpour drowning out the disruption. Folks on either side of the stage rose to their feet, their own booing raining down on those being ejected. A table at 2 o'clock, followed by a table at 9 o'clock, rose the octogenarian occupants creating an omnidirectional phalanx. The fervor by which they slowly but surely rose to the challenge moved me to my core. I was rendered speechless. I remember once reading about a school of dolphins that had encircled a swimmer to protect them from an approaching great white shark. This felt like that. Before long, every table was shielding me from the attack. These older men and women, a rampart of reassurance, absorbing the vituperation. To my eternal surprise, nearly everyone around me began clapping, encouraging me to keep going. The disdain redirected at my saboteurs, the ringing endorsement directed toward me, heightened the dissonance in this surreal scene. The group of 6 finally exited, and I'll never forget the exclamation point that one woman provided as she pointed toward their empty table and yelled, "They couldn't handle the truth." And then, as if she could not warm my jaded heart anymore, this vivacious woman with the animal print brows then implored me, "Keep going, hun." Having taken the stage as both minuscule and massive, from bar basements to Hollywood sound stages, from shows with over 1,000 people to those with only one. This stands as my most rewarding stand-up experience ever. However, I cannot help but point out what this heartwarming display suggested about our greater discourse 3 years into a presidency that had coarsened dialogue, polarizing our society and those living in it. It proved to me that surprises can come when I least expect them, and from those I least expect to provide this sort of corroboration, the kind that forces you to ultimately recalibrate your own perspective. With another general election on the horizon, this discovery warned me on my wintry commute back to the Big Apple. If a young Black man and a room full of older white Americans can reach a dynamic consensus amidst those pockets of divisiveness, then not only does it forecast something favorable, but it also suggests there's actual hope for our American dialectic. If that very showroom, operating as a microcosm, reflects dynamics progressing throughout the American macrocosm, then the unimpeachable truth born out of the unyielding, inflexible laws of comedy, and through this very act itself, almost ensures that this country is gonna be all right. It is a potent reminder that there is but one truth, and it is ultimately impervious to misinterpretation. Fake news may be Trump's churlish, often successful attempt at muddying the waters, but when it comes to verity, that ingredient indispensable to our art form, there is little room for confusion when presented with such palpable concord, when the lowly estimation of him has been verified by most. He may get away with fake news, but no comedian gets away with fake laughter, especially when you have a live, liquored up crowd. And yes, a repudiation of Trump and his influence can indeed spread throughout a large group. The last excerpt that I would like to read is from the chapter titled "The Joke's on Us." There's an earlier chapter in the book called "The Joke is on You," which I talk about, me lampooning Trump. But as things seem to have come full circle in a disastrous way, as the world was, upended with COVID, I wanted to address it. I had so many prescribed ends for this book that things kept happening, whether it be the Mueller report and then impeachment and then coronavirus. So I had to write about how this was affecting me and affecting life in Brooklyn. We head into the hallway after 10 days of zero human contact aside from the two of us and an extended Netflix marathon of It Doesn't Even Matter. Placed in dual confinement, enduring the harsh sentence in a one-bedroom apartment, the hours had scarily blended together into a miasma. This beast had soon consumed entire 24-hour increments of time greedily, almost effortlessly. The paucity of daily purpose altered time as we knew it, and multiple days blended it into an endless one that neither of us could make heads or tails of. Whatever was gnawing away at the clock gnawed away at us. Somewhere along the way, during this endless day, we ceased to be two individuals defined by habit and reason. So, resisting unsustainable torpor, me and my wife devised a plan to bust out. Our depleted rations also dictated that we must brave this brave new world sooner or later. So whether it was boredom or merely the Ben and Jerry's calling our names, we readjusted our masks, put the building door behind us with a generous dollop of Purell, and with her sanitized hand in mind, we marched swiftly to the tunnel. Immediately amplifying the intensity of the moment was our inability to shake the feeling of isolation reinforced over several weeks. It greeted us the very second we exit the building. It turns out that the sorrow had decided to linger, sort of like a party guest who can't take the fucking hint. Having already consumed so much, it was now accompanying us the rest of the way, that unpleasantness now standing in where kaleidoscope and captivating New Yorkers used to be. This feeling was only further reinforced when we soon realized that in a city of 8 million souls, ours are the only two floating down our block at this present time. We barely made it a block before the impression we were starring in our own post-apocalyptic science fiction film became all too real. We were the last two people on Earth, our need to forge an action that would not only save ourselves, but all of civilization. Or at least that's what I chose to entertain myself, to short circuit the hardwiring that and all the fear that steadily began to encroach. Thus, my quiet block began to compound our disquietude. You would think that being free from prying eyes, the emotions might offset each other, but my mask was soon pumping like a party favor. The likelihood that it was conspiring to make me hyperventilate becomes even realer as each breath I drew grew more audible amid the acoustics of the pleated fabric. It was almost as if I was plagiarizing myself, my movements in this moment dictated by memory more than by any authentic intention. The stunning images captured on celluloid in movies like I Am Legend and 12 Monkeys was no match for the reality that greeted us. We have to contend with the actuality of shuttered businesses we'd only recently frequented. A block that used to buzz, especially at this time of morning, would now barely mumble. We bypassed one after the other. Our local pizza joint, the indelible smell that once greeted our nostrils, gone, given the mask covering our faces in the store's closed and freshly graffitied grate. The perpetual shutterdom showcased a bunch of budding artists as almost overnight would-be Basquiat's and Banksy's had commandeered every inch of these steel canvases. The scene replayed itself at the Jewish delicatessen, its chocolate croissants and bagels also long gone, the wonderful scent buried in the graveyard of memory, entombed beyond another mask and another shuttered grate. The mellow journey we had made countless times took on the pulsating tenor of a suicide mission. The short subway ride to the supermarket, 2 stops, was enough to strike fear in both of our hearts. We emerged from our hole and surveyors seemed no different from before. Once busy streets produced only a handful of pedestrians. The threat was still omnipresent despite the evaporation, so I grabbed my wife's hand and navigated the perilous maze to key foods, almost militaristic in both my sense of duty and the commands I found myself barking out. Stay behind me, follow me. I felt my top lip begin to puddle from the condensation under the mask. My nerves were compounding the percolation. My head was on a swivel as well as I frantically processed every degree of the concrete panorama unspooling before us. The brick trees almost felt like a canopy framing my tunnel vision as an old white lady approached from 11 o'clock, prompting us to quickly cross the street. My steering my wife away from clear and present danger felt tantamount to tiptoeing around landmines and louse. Both of us were doing our damnedest to evade any sort of vicious jungle ambush. The moment we breached the mechanical doors, the bedlam greeted us. It was instantly evident why the streets were so empty. Everyone was in here. The omnipresent surgical mask now obscured the kind, familiar faces we were used to observing. People watching, that most entertaining of Brooklyn pastimes, was now a relic of the past, like the dodo or dead languages, or as the world would soon lament, handshakes and hugs. It reinforced one of the first lessons I gleaned from this cataclysm, that our vanity is the very first thing to be scuttled. Given that we would soon jettison the joys of human touch, the stress of survival renders the material immaterial. Cuteness in such a climate completely superfluous and therefore expendable. Aisles that once operated as de facto runways were gutted. Society's collapse had precipitated a morass, promoting the grocery store into an epicenter of sheer frenzy. Shopping carts were parked in perpetual gridlock. The human traffic that accompanied each nearly circled the entire store, creating a rage endemic to the BQE at 5 o'clock. The normal rhythms of my vibrant blended community had been drowned out by an inimical staccato of confused chatter, it discordant with the steady, sonorous beat we all usually followed. Upon discovering that there was no more eggs, West Indians, Jews, and Latinos all exclaimed disappointment in their respective patois, creating a cacophony of confusion and contempt. Mira, oi, and ras clot was repeated in the pasta aisle as well, its ransacked shelves reminiscent of the old TV show Supermarket Sweep. Several feet of options have been reduced to 2 boxes of lasagna noodles and 1 creased and punctured offering of large cells. I overheard the same Rastafarian, upon spying the paucity of pasta and rice offerings, unload a barrage of righteous shrapnel. Babylon, the one word I could discern from his patter of indignation, was soon followed by a clear and chilling admonishment. America will never be the same. The sage-like premonition barked from beneath his crown of lock sticks with me as the tilt from his overfilled cap disappeared around the corner. Although many of the items on our list go unchecked, we replenish most of our rations in a haze and get the fuck out of there. That's it for the excerpts from the first few chapters. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Mark.
Great. Thank you so much, Cyrus. That was a really wonderful reading. Those were some enlightening and inspiring passages you shared with us.
Thank you.
To all our viewers, please write your questions in the chat box in YouTube, and I will relay them to Cyrus as we go along. First, I'll start with what was your inspiration for writing this book? You know, you sort of talked about the context of the last 4 years, and that led you to the last 40 years, and then the last 400 years. What specifically gave you that impetus to put pen to paper?
Well, I found that, at the time, Twitter only had a 140 character limit. So you can only sort of get out but so much in a short inspired burst. Even though they ended up expanding it to 280 characters, I felt like it wasn't enough to provide the moment with the necessary context that it deserved. Moreover, I found that people were treating Trump and the Trump presidency as an anomaly, where if you look back historically, he's part of a corrosive continuum that has merely laid dormant, but has never fully gone away in our American discourse. I felt that I needed to address this more comprehensively. And so it forced me to look back at not only my life, but as well as the existence of Black Americans on North America. Donald Trump is, akin to the Strom Thurmonds, as I talk about in the book. He's akin to Richard Nixon, his presidential counterpart, but he's also akin to Alexander Hamilton. If you go back you have to really look that far back to find somebody who's almost relished in his disdain for people of color, any sort of ethnicity. So the moment was generated organically from, I just felt like I couldn't not write this book. It was just almost like as I write in my preface, like I felt like a burden had been placed on me and I just had to write it off.
Great. And how did you figure out how to finish? I mean, you'd said before there's really one event after another. So if there's really no end to the Trump sideshow, where was your stopping point?
Well, it's so funny. It's like I said, I started writing this book in August of 2018. And so it had so many prescribed ends that I thought, okay, with the Mueller report, that's going to be it. Put a period, I'm done. And then the Mueller report turned into impeachment. And I was like, okay, he's gonna get impeached. That's my natural ending, a perfect ending to this book. I'm gonna put a period and I'll be done. And then you saw his acquittal. And then we saw COVID-19. And then we saw the unrest erupting out of Minneapolis and other pockets of the country. And it was just like, I couldn't put the pen down until, well, to my editor's chagrin, he sort of said, enough is enough. You're already, I think at one point, God bless him, we had amassed over like 750 pages. And unless you're the first Black president, ain't nobody trying to read 750 pages of what you got to say. So it's like, all right, let me put a bow on this and stop writing, because otherwise, like I said in the preface, everything that's happened since the election with him trying to attack, the sanctity of the democracy and throw out votes, I could have kept writing. So eventually, I kind of end the book on this past summer and what happened in light of the George Floyd protests that, erupted nationwide, and seeing Brooklyn transform and respond to what was happening. It felt like a natural close to this book.
Yeah, I was also going to ask, how has setting affected your writing? You spoke about your upbringing in Roxbury, Boston, and of course your recent life in Brooklyn. What are some of the most poignant Brooklyn, New York moments you can think of?
Well, for me, looking back, firstly, seeing like the sort of belligerent racism, I tie it into the book. There's several situations throughout my life, and most people of color, like I said, I write this book in many ways for people of color will recognize these archetypes. They'll recognize subtle racism. They'll recognize those those incarnations like Trump, who are a little bit more vociferous and boastful and vocal about their racism. So in my life, I've encountered all these different archetypes, and I felt like I needed to sort of frame them accurately. So I write about my experiences with subtle racism growing up in Boston and going to school in the suburbs, and then some of the more vocal and charged moments that came up in Dorchester. It all sort of lends a greater context to this moment, because throughout my life, I've encountered, racial animus. And so this moment was not new. It was merely a continuation of something, like I say in the book, a fire whose embers never really went out. living in Brooklyn is sort of like, and I said this to my wife when we were voting and we were getting really scared for a minute there, especially after, 9 o'clock on election night. We can often fool ourselves. We live in a liberal bubble. So we're around cosmopolitan people, we're around international people, we're around diversity. Like I mentioned there, I'm surrounded by Hasidic Jews and West Indians and Latinos. So I sort of tricked myself into thinking that America was going to feel the same way I did and the way my neighbors do. And so writing the book, I've kind of gotten reinforcement of that. And then when his eventual loss, it bred the most spontaneous, amazing, beautiful, uproarious celebration was it 3 Saturdays ago, as people were marching through Brooklyn, banging pots and pans and honking horns. It was just surreal to be in Brooklyn in that moment.
Very cool. Yeah, a real New York moment for sure.
Absolutely.
One of the questions that came through earlier about your selection from Brother from Another Planet, how old were you when you followed your cousin?
That would have been the summer of '92, so I would have been 12 years old.
12 years old. Great.
12 years old.
Another question was, have you tweeted something you regretted? And what's your favorite tweet from this year?
Have I tweeted something? Yeah, it's so funny, in writing this book, tweets appear throughout the text. So the book is very long and, the prose is essentially broken up by several tweets. I call the tweets in many ways the spine of the book, the skeleton, if you will. And I initially started writing the book around the tweets. And then at some point, I just forgot all about them and just began writing the book. So then I had to undertake the task of finding tweets that would actually fit in with what I'd written. And so I got my Twitter archive, which is this dense 20,000 word long document, or 20,000 long tweet document. So I had to sift. My wife, my beautiful, wonderful wife, who's been so great and so pivotal to this whole process. Her and I were going through these old tweets, and I saw a lot of stuff that I'd forgotten I'd said, and that I appropriately deleted well after the fact. So I saw a few things that I was not necessarily proud of. I can't believe that I said that in that heated moment. But as the book sort of reflects, election 2016, the things that happened around Charlottesville, like I documented in real time America's anger, or certainly Black America's anger. Like I was negritude in that moment. I was just firing on all cylinders and just combating what was happening in social media, what was happening in the news, what was happening around the country. So I said a lot of things I probably shouldn't have said. But of this past year, my favorite tweet was actually one that I think Kerry Washington and a few, like every now and again, like a tweet will just go crazy, it'll blow up. And I'm like, I wonder how that happened, because they'll usually hover around 1,000 or 2,000 likes or retweets. But every now and again, like somebody notable will retweet something, whether it be Joy Reid, or in this case, it was Kerry Washington. And she retweeted my tweet, which I think you showed before the event about Joe Biden. And I liken him to, a rebound. Like a lot of people, Trump, you've been in an abusive relationship, and Biden just may be that nice rebound who gets you from your nightmare to your dream love. And then I say he might be who you date before you discover you're into women.
I saw that. That was very funny.
Yeah.
Do you have anyone specific who inspired you, either to write this book or in your stand-up career?
It's hard because I can only point to the people around me. My mother inspired me to write. My wife inspired me to write, because I felt like it was I'm too humble to say that I have a talent at it, but it was something that I hadn't always honored, that skill set. And so I think for years, my mother had admonished me to sort of like, use my brain. And so this was me in many ways, just sort of, as she also used to say when I was a little boy, she would admonish me and say, take the chain off your brain. This is me taking the chain off my brain and just sort of like, okay, the stand-up art form is wonderful and I love to make people laugh, but it didn't always necessarily lend itself to the sort of dissection that this book sort of brought out. And the same thing goes with comedy in general. Like there's a moment when you have to kind of just be serious. And I felt this moment, what was happening organically, I couldn't question it. I definitely didn't fight it. I just sort of let it take me over. And as I say, a burden was sort of placed on me, and a moment that demanded I be a little bit more serious. And so, whether it's my mother, whether it's my ancestors, whether it's my father, like there's sonorous voices in my ear that sort of poked and prodded me, and they got this out of me. So I take no credit, it was all them.
Great. Do you feel being a student of Metco helped inform your take on the Trump time and his overt racism? Did it help you find your voice as a comedian?
I'd already, it kind of, I don't know, I'd say in the book how Trump, in many ways sort of became my muse, but in so many ways, I was already juggling these topics beforehand. I was discussing race, like, I remember when I did Last Comic Standing, I was like one of the only comics who actually outright had jokes that pertain to race. I talk about my then girlfriend, my now wife, and being in an interracial romance and how, I complain about gentrification, but I gentrified my own apartment. It's like things like that. So I was always juggling heavier topics. As I say in the book, I like to delve into the deeper end. A lot of humorists like to splash around in superficial waters, but I always was one to try to probe the deep end about growing up in the inner city. So Metco informed me to a degree, just that dual reality, as I talk about, it's almost like W.B. Du Bois's dissertation on double consciousness, having experienced that early in life. And also being in Boston, you get the overt and you get the covert, sort of like you run up against it on a daily basis. And, also writing the book about how we moved to Dorchester and how there were little incidents that began to bubble up there. And I had some of those overt displays that sort of, I felt bookended by the subtle and the overt. So yeah, Boston factored in heavy into this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of context behind it.
A hell of a lot.
Onto another social media or another social media platform. Yeah. How do you feel about TikTok?
Well, I'm scared because people telling me that they're gonna like hack your phone if you download it or something. So I'm like, maybe I'm scared. I've been hearing too many horror stories, but I think it's great. I mean, I think I may have aged out of TikTok. I say to my wife, maybe we need to come up with some funny dances and we can try to show these kids what's what. But I think I passed that invisible threshold. Like I can't keep up with y'all kids anymore. I have to admit defeat. I'm 40 now. I'm like I gotta stay in my lane. So I'll just type things out.
Yes, very, very new platform, very confusing if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah.
Onto another aspect of media. How is your podcast going? The podcast you do, Cornbread and Haggis.
My podcast is going really, really good. It's my wife and I started a podcast. My wife is actually Scottish. So the name Cornbread and Haggis comes from like a melding of these two cultures. African-American culture and Scottish culture. So I bring the cornbread, she brings the haggis. And we really just talk about like our relationship, which has sort of become another sort of feast on Twitter. People are loving our marital banter and our cross-cultural banter. So that's become a big source of comedy for me. And we just, we regale people, and I guess our Lucy and Desi of the 21st century. Our little exploits, I say coming from Boston, her being from the UK, she comes home and the apartment's dirty. So I run around quickly fixing things and washing dishes going, the British are coming, the British are coming.
Yeah, that'll definitely inspire fear on both sides. So how do you see, as a final question, how do you see this book being relevant in a post-Trump America? I know you expressed a lot of optimism, especially after your stand-up portion too.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I'm cognizant of, I'm hyper aware of that, I don't want us to develop Trump amnesia. I don't want us to treat this moment as an anomaly or something that is, incapable of occurring again. I feel that the vision has been sowed to such a successful manner that he's already laid the groundwork for a potential run in 2024. We've seen how racism has been emboldened to the point that, as I say in the book, it used to be something that was handled surreptitiously, at least in my lifetime. But the fact that people have been emboldened to sort of discriminate and to be callous with it and to be hateful and to be just vengeful with it, I feel that that's not going away anytime soon. So if anything, I wanted to write, I wanted to record this time. I wanted to bear witness. I wanted to, like I say, I talk about the folly of what I thought was a silly politician, but it somehow morphed into a greater examination of what it means to be a Black American in the 21st century. And in that, it's like we have to stay vigilant. We have to be aware. We certainly cannot compromise any more of ourselves. We have to beware. We have to essentially be guardians, because this can and will happen again. So maybe I say I've written for eyes that have yet to open, but I want the record of this time, this unbearable American moment, to be there for posterity, so that people in future generations know that we can't repeat this mistake again.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your reading and for being with us tonight, Cyrus. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Again, if you make a donation through Fort Point Theater Channel, $50 or more, we will send you a copy of the new book, Tweeting Truth to Power by Cyrus. That should be coming, I believe you said around mid-January the books will be shipping?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And thank you so much for the Fort Point Theater Channel. Thank you so much for hosting me. Yeah, this was a wonderful experience. Definitely go out and buy the book. Yeah, pre-order it now.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.